welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 11, The Final Rift. We are back to our regularly scheduled programming this week on our journey to and through the Korean War. We start not in Korea, though, but in Moscow, as leader of the newly minted People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, arrives after a 10-day train journey. We're going to spend today talking about three things that are all happening together at the end of 1949 and in the first months of 1950 that contribute to the final rift between the communists and the non-communists. First, the first meeting between Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. Second, Kim Il-sung's efforts to pressure his benefactors for war against the South. And third, the American efforts to keep the People's Republic of China out of the Soviet sphere of influence. After the proclamation of the People's Republic, Mao's first order of business was to meet with Stalin to ensure Soviet support for the new Chinese state. Mao also wanted to discuss the main goals of international communism, but Soviet support for the new government in Beijing was paramount. I like to think of the meeting between Stalin and Mao in three phases. First, what the Soviet and Chinese goals were going into the meeting. Second, how they reached an agreement on principles. And third, the final negotiations of the treaty. In the meetings between Soviet and Chinese communist representatives leading up to Stalin and Mao's meeting, the Chinese were very happy with the things they were told. The Soviets had apologized for all the right things and said all the right words to get the Chinese to the table. And while he was supportive of the Communist Party of China, though, Stalin was overall non-committal before meeting Mao. The Soviets had signed treaties with the Republic of China confirming their rights and privileges in northeastern China in the immediate aftermath of the war, and Stalin's main goal of this meeting was to keep those rights. And even though they had the atomic bomb, the Soviets, and quite specifically Stalin, were operating from a mindset of anxiety and insecurity when Mao and his entourage arrived in Moscow in December of 1949. The Americans were building up the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and an independent West Germany in Europe, and maintained a large presence in East Asia, in Japan. Stalin feared the Soviet Union was going to be totally surrounded, which only heightened the need for a larger fence of satellite states around the USSR. These states would keep the Americans at arm's length and allow the Soviets a greater response time for a land invasion. Communist China provided a large buffer in East Asia. That said, Stalin's focus was still on Europe. When East Germany was proclaimed as the new German Democratic Republic just 1 week after Mao's proclamation in Beijing, Stalin sent a hearty note of congratulations to East Berlin. He did not do the same for Mao. I don't think this is because Stalin hated Mao or anything. It was more of an apathetic disinterest. So Stalin's goals going into his December meetings with Mao were twofold: solidify Soviet security interests in East Asia, and ensure Chinese support in what Stalin saw as the inevitable Third World War. Mao's goals were, obviously, quite different. He knew he needed Stalin's support, as Stalin was the top dog of global communism. But once he got it, he could pretty much cruise on that initial support and maintain his communist legitimacy through his own efforts. This is partially because Mao had achieved power on his own without the support of the Soviets, but also because Mao's communism mixed in a good amount of Confucian ideals that spoke directly to his base in the rural peasantry of China. Stalin's initial support was important because of Mao's second and more important goal. The People's Republic needed Soviet financial, military, and economic aid to rebuild itself after 30 years of chaos. This was for two reasons. 1. Yeah, China had mostly been in chaos for the last 30 years and was pretty far behind in terms of economic output. Rebuilding the country was important, as Mao did want to make the average person's life better in his new country. Second, Mao and his Republican counterpart Chiang Kai-shek did not believe the Civil War was truly over and wanted to take the war into its next stage. From here on out, Mao wanted Stalin's support for an invasion of the Republican redoubt on the island of Taiwan. For the time being, though, Mao mostly set aside his desire for an invasion to achieve his primary goals of economic, financial, and military aid to rebuild China. The Soviets, during Mao's journey to Moscow, made several missteps that made the early stages of the agreement on principles difficult. First, Soviet representatives Vyacheslav Molotov and Nikolai Bulganin declined Mao's invitation for dinner in the town where he would transfer from his train to a Russian train, ignoring the lavish table set for the esteemed Soviet guests. Next, the Soviets, before he arrived in Moscow, asked Mao not to make a statement at the train station, but to just give them a copy and they'll put it in the papers for him. The two leaders' first meeting did not go particularly smoothly either. Mao told Stalin that he wanted to replace the existing Soviet Republican treaty with one between the new government and the Soviet Union. Stalin immediately said no, specifically pointing out that to do so could jeopardize the principles agreed upon with the Americans and British at Yalta all those years ago. After some more pleasantries, Stalin said to Mao, "You have come from afar, and it is not good for you to return empty-handed. What should we do now? Do you have any ideas and wishes?" Mao responded, "We have come here this time to complete a certain task. A certain thing has to be done, and it must be both beautiful and tasty." What a wonderful response. I wish more of the documents I produced were described as beautiful or tasty. Mao clarified that, to him, beautiful meant beautiful to the people of the world, and tasty meant practical in content. Mao's clarification did not do much for Stalin, though, and both remained obstinate for the next 4 days. On the 20th, Mao summoned Iv Kovalev, Stalin's representative to China, to his residence outside Moscow and stated bluntly that he saw two paths forward, one ending in a treaty and one ending without a treaty. Both paths involved Stalin and Mao discussing a range of issues in general terms, but the treaty path required Mao to send for Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier and foreign minister, to negotiate and sign a formal agreement. The non-treaty path would not require Zhou's presence and would end without a formal agreement. Kovalev reported this to Stalin, and then a few days later submitted a report that was highly critical of Mao's leadership of the Communist Party of China. While Stalin and Mao met several times over the next 2 weeks, Kovalev's report made Stalin weary to finally agree to treaty negotiations. It was only after Mao expressed his willingness to leave Moscow without a formal agreement that Stalin made his decision. To do so, Mao gave the Soviets 3 options: formal agreement, a joint statement devoid of details stating that the two countries had agreed to the basics of a treaty, or a joint statement detailing the important points of the Sino-Soviet bilateral relationship. These last 2 options were as untenable to Mao as they were to Stalin because they were more or less unsubstantive, and left the Soviets with just one viable option. On January 2nd, Stalin agreed to begin negotiations for a new treaty. It was quickly agreed that the new treaty would mostly follow the form of the 1945 Soviet Republican Treaty, with the People's Republic of China replacing the Republic of China. Soviets also quickly agreed to provide the PRC with a set of loans worth $300 million over the next few years. For Zhou's arrival on January 20th, Mao and Stalin, alongside Stalin's team of advisors and colleagues, turned to international issues. When President Truman stated on January 5th that the United States would not provide military aid to Chiang Kai-shek's forces, and when the British established diplomatic relations with the PRC on the 6th, Mao again dreamed of finally ending the Civil War and kicking the Republic of China off Taiwan for good. This was a problem for Stalin. Any quote-unquote Chinese solution to the problem of Taiwan posed the threat of a greater US-PRC relationship. Stalin wanted to keep the People's Republic firmly on the side of the Soviets. The new treaty would need to ensure that a strong alliance was built between the two communist powers. This was directly countered by Anglo-American efforts to drive a wedge between Beijing and Moscow. Those efforts came about from a desire in Washington and London to maintain a counterbalance in East Asia against the Soviets. China becoming communist skewed the balance between communists and non-communists against the non-communists. The Anglo-American alliance hoped that, by keeping the People's Republic out of the Soviet sphere, they could strengthen their chances in what they saw as an inevitable war against the Soviets. East Asia, save for Japan, would become China's responsibility. The Greater Pacific region would still fall under the American defensive umbrella, though, which was spelled out by Secretary of State Dean Acheson on January 12th. That day, at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., Acheson spoke about the defensive perimeter the United States was creating in the Pacific Ocean. This perimeter ran from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, down through Japan and the Ryukyus, to the Philippines. No mention of Taiwan or South Korea was made. While this may have signaled to the Chinese, Koreans, and Soviets that the Americans were abandoning any previous responsibility to defend those 2 places, it was actually an attempt to get Mao to back away from the Soviets. Not necessarily towards the Americans, just away from the Soviets. Leaving Korea out of the perimeter was mostly unconnected to the absence of Taiwan. many in the American diplomatic and defense leadership were not particularly interested in fighting any war for Korea at this time. The effect was the same, though. Both Mao and Kim Il-sung were intrigued and pressed Stalin just that much harder to allow them each to enact their respective war plans. However, just as Mao had asked Stalin about Taiwan before January 12th, so too had Kim about his southern counterpart. Back in episode 9, we discussed the American policy of containment, of containing communism to its existing areas and limiting its spread to new regions. After the Republic of China's retreat to Taiwan, a different path was required for interacting with China. This new path was first laid out in the policy memo NSC 34/1. From January 1949, when this memo was approved, to February 1950, keeping the Soviets and Chinese apart was the main foreign policy goal of the United States and Asia. This was a goal the Americans shared with the British, but their situations differed in one major way. The British had, just a few years prior, finally regained control of one of the jewels of the British colonial empire, Hong Kong. Just off the coast of the southeastern Chinese mainland, Hong Kong was a bustling center for trade and commerce, and allowed the British to project power throughout Southeast Asia. After the proclamation of the PRC, the People's Liberation Army was moving towards Hong Kong. The British had two options to ensure the security of the colonial city-state: defend it against a massive enemy, or negotiate with the new government in Beijing to ensure its safety. Only one of those was a good choice for a country that was still rebuilding from the last war. On January 6, 1950, Britain officially recognized the People's Republic, keeping Hong Kong under the Union Jack. The only stated reason the United States did not do the same was because Acheson wanted the PRC to uphold prior treaty commitments. As shown by Mao's efforts to get a new treaty with the Soviets, this was not going to happen. The Chinese saw the existing treaties as unequal and biased against China, which was not wrong. It was not until January that Acheson began reconsidering his criteria for recognition, but it all came too late. The Anglo-American effort to divide the Chinese from the Soviets failed on February 14th with the signing of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. This treaty appeared from the outside to solidify the Sino-Soviet alliance as a true monolith of international communism. After his arrival on January 20th, Cho split the Chinese delegation in two, with one team focused on the specific wording of the main agreement and the other team working on other, lesser agreements. The key components of the treaty centered around mutual assistance against aggression, specifically against aggression by Japan or those states allied with Japan. Two things to note here. Japan was, surprisingly, still the main concern in East Asia, even though it was still rebuilding after a devastating loss in World War II. And this was also clearly pointed at the Americans, who just 1 month before had announced Japan as the centerpiece of their defensive perimeter in the Pacific. Furthermore, this treaty was written in such a way that only the common interests of both the Soviets and the Chinese required consultation. In treaties between the Soviet Union and other communist states, any topic of interest to either party required consultation, which basically means that the Soviets could impose their decisions on the Eastern European satellites. This made the treaty more equal and gave the Chinese a diplomatic victory. Actually, the whole treaty was a diplomatic victory for the Chinese, gaining key concessions from the Soviets that made it a markedly better treaty than the 1945 agreement. Those concessions were part of a set of checks and balances that allowed both the Chinese and the Soviets, both Mao and Stalin, to accomplish most of the goals they had going into the negotiations and return home to declare a victory. Throughout 1949 and early 1950, Kim made a set of official and unofficial trips to Moscow to discuss various issues with Stalin. Now, the unofficial meetings probably did not happen, but the discussions certainly took place either in person, over telegram, or via intermediary over the course of the year. In late 1949, Kim presented Stalin with a plan to reunify the peninsula through military action. The one thing that kept Stalin from agreeing to the operation then was that he had not yet met with Mao. Stalin did not want to commit Soviet troops to a Korean operation for two reasons. One, he hoped the Chinese would take on the supporting role or even become directly involved if necessary. And two, Stalin wanted the Korean operation to test the waters of the Americans' willingness to intervene in smaller conflicts that don't directly involve the Soviet Union. Throughout the next couple months, as Mao was in Moscow, Kim kept prodding Ambassador Shtaikov to tell Stalin how weak the South was. How just a few more infantry divisions could really put the North over the edge on offensive strength, and how more military aid would ensure a swift victory and reunification of Korea under communist leadership. In April, Stalin agreed to the idea of invasion on one condition. Kim had to convince Mao as well, reportedly saying, "If you should get kicked in the teeth, I shall not lift a finger. You have to ask Mao for all the help." As you can see, there's this real tug of war between Mao and Stalin that could have been spoiled by the Americans. It would have taken a lot to break up the burgeoning Moscow-Beijing dyad, though, like more than Washington would have ever logically given up. Stalin wanted to maintain the concessions given to the Soviets by Chiang Kai-shek in 1945, but he also wanted to keep China within the Soviet orbit. The Americans just wanted to pull the Chinese away from the Soviets. It was a question of who wanted their thing more, and who could get the timing right. Ensuring that international communism remained under his guidance was far more important to Stalin than the opposite was to the Americans. With Mao in Moscow, it was nearly inevitable that some agreement would come out of their meeting. Furthermore, everyone thought Europe would be the main battleground for the next major war. No one expected an international conflict to break out in Asia. In May, Kim traveled to Beijing. Although the trip was short, just 4 days, it ended with Mao's approval of Kim's plans for war. Mao at first was skeptical of Kim's claims that victory would be swift, but decided that, to stay consistent with his desire to reunify his own country, the Koreans must be allowed to reunify themselves as well. Mao also did not believe that the Americans would intervene, but even if they did, Kim mollified any of those fears by stating his belief that the war would be over in a month, not nearly enough time for the Americans to mobilize a meaningful force to Korea. Presumably, Kim also overstated Stalin's enthusiasm for the invasion, as he would probably also do for the Soviets, playing up Mao's support to ensure greater support from Stalin. All of this added up to Mao not necessarily approving the plans, but accepting them. And that's all that Kim needed. Just as a brief aside to mention Taiwan, after Mao's acceptance of Kim's plans for war, there's a bit of a race on between the two to see who can invade their mortal enemy first, Kim and South Korea, or Mao and Taiwan. The Chinese People's Liberation Army even began massing troops in the southeast, preparing for a massive amphibious invasion of Taiwan. The reason it was a race between the two leaders was because both suspected that, surely, the Americans would not allow 2 wars of communist expansion against American-supported regimes. We'll see in a couple weeks that, actually, it's mostly correct. This race ended in June when the Central Military Commission in Beijing postponed any invasion of Taiwan to 1951 after a slower-than-expected buildup of PLA forces in southeastern China. Okay, back to Korea. With Mao's acceptance in hand, Kim began planning for war very much in earnest. Before that, though, Stalin had already sent a team of military advisors to Pyongyang, and larger shipments of Soviet weapons and vehicles were already arriving in Korean ports regularly. Wait, what? So Stalin told Kim he needed Mao's approval and then just went and started helping the Koreans prepare for war anyway? Yeah. As argued by Goncharov, Lewis, and Zhu in their excellent book Uncertain Partners, Stalin was motivated by a few different goals. Quote, to expand the buffer zone along his border, to create a springboard against Japan that could be used during a future global conflict, to test the American resolve, to intensify the hostility between Beijing and Washington, and to draw American power away from Europe. End quote. To Stalin, these goals could be accomplished with a North Korean military operation whether or not Mao wanted to be involved. But no matter what, Mao would have to get involved at some point if the Koreans didn't end the war quickly. Mao wouldn't be able to tolerate an American ally so close to his northern border if the North Koreans lost. If Mao did not approve of the plans, the operation could still move forward, and if it was successful, Stalin could take credit. Therefore, Stalin held the upper hand in discussions with both Kim and Mao and was able to steer the goals of both, which again was reunification of their countries, into satisfying his goals. In April of 1950, the Americans began to totally retool their national foreign policy. NSC 68 laid out the need to rebuild the American military, which had greatly diminished in capacity with the drawdowns of the late 1940s. This policy memo, which wasn't fully approved until September, and its outlined change in policy were expansions of containment and were quickly put into effect. Part of this is because of personnel changes within the policy-making apparatus of the US government. Our old friend, Dean Rusk, one of the guys responsible for the division of Korea in the first place, stepped in as director of the Office of Far Eastern Affairs, replacing Walton Butterworth. Butterworth advocated for working with the People's Republic, but Rusk's military background led him towards a different opinion, to say the least. With NSC 68, the United States was going to really lean into building that fence around the Soviet Union that Stalin so feared. Taiwan also re-entered the defensive line in the Western Pacific, and South Korea took on a new importance. Now, to fail to intervene in a communist invasion of South Korea or Taiwan would potentially destroy any trust other at-risk countries had in the United States, totally shattering the American global defense strategy of mutual defense against communism. This was especially true for South Korea, as it was a country totally created by the United States. The new and improved policy of containment was built around the idea that containment would not work if it was not backed up by a massively capable and easily mobilized military. This is specifically mentioned in the memo as a way to counter the new Sino-Soviet alliance and to regain superiority over that alliance, now that they had proven their ability to build an atomic bomb. While the memo overstated the Soviets' ability to overrun Western Europe, it succeeded in its goal of rousing American leadership to reinvest in its military. It shifted the conversation from one of containment, although it did seek to strengthen the ring around the Soviets, to one of rollback, ensuring that the United States would now actively undermine communist governments around the world. NSC 68 was so important at this stage of the Cold War that it would remain classified for 25 years. One last thing I want to cover today is MacArthur's Japan. As we know, Douglas MacArthur has been in Tokyo since the end of 1945 as Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, overseeing the American occupation of Japan. For the most part, Japan was the focal point of the United States' East Asian policy. Japan was to be the neutral magnet that would keep China out of the Soviet sphere. After the Sino-Soviet Treaty in February 1950, though, American thought turned towards signing a separate peace treaty with the Japanese that would ensure its place wholly within the American sphere of influence. This is in opposition to what the Japanese leadership wanted, a peace treaty with all parties that would keep Japan neutral. Richard Thornton, in his book Odd Man Out, places a single question at the center of this new dilemma. How could the United States give Japan the greatest opportunity to prosper without making it dependent on the United States in the long term, all while keeping the changes in policy triggered by NSC 68 secret? The solution was to make it clear to the Japanese leadership that neutrality was no longer an option. To do so, the Japanese were made aware of a disagreement between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the State Department, in which the Joint Chiefs declared a peace treaty premature, and that, if a treaty were proposed, it needed to include provisions to keep American forces in Japan and also be accepted by the Soviets, which was definitely not going to happen. The State Department countered by proposing an American-Japanese peace treaty that the Soviets and Chinese could sign later, alongside a separate bilateral agreement for American forces to stay in Japan. Given these two choices, it is obvious which one the Japanese would have to take. A peace treaty was drafted in March of 1950, but it would stay unsigned for 18 months. And that small detail will be important once the United States realizes it needed to build a large logistics base in the region around, say, June 25th, 1950. MacArthur certainly had a hand in this change in policy. Although he had spoken in favor of an end to the occupation in 1947, by 1950 he wanted to keep American forces in Japan for the foreseeable future to ensure that the Soviets or Chinese wouldn't attempt to subvert Japanese neutrality. Like many American generals, MacArthur despised communism and hated that the Republicans had lost in China. He agreed with the folks back in Washington that Japan would now need to be a key part of keeping the dangers of communism at bay. To conclude, everything we've talked about today and over the last few weeks are the main reasons why the Korean War is known as the Korean War and not the Korean Civil War. Even though there was a distinctly domestic component of the causes of the war that we will discuss more next week, the international aspects of the conflict were as large, if not larger. Without the United Nations, without the Cold War, without a communist China, the Korean War would have gone very differently for everyone involved. I wouldn't have discussed these things if they didn't play a role in the main thread of our history, if they weren't important to understanding the many different causes of this conflict. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with the battle lines drawn and the decision for war made in Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing. Next week, we will have a 2-episode set released back-to-back about the preparations for war in both North and South Korea, with Ready Player 1 and Ready Player 2. 2 weeks from now, we will finally reach the big show, the invasion of one Korea by the other. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.